Professor David Lesch, welcome to the Khanistan podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Brilliant. It's pleasure's mine. David, you're an expert on Syria politics, geopolitics, and in many ways you have a very unique insight into the affairs of the country, which is why I'm really excited about this interview today. Before we get started, for the benefit of our listeners, our viewers, would you take a moment to tell us a bit about your background?
Sure. Well, I'm a professor of Middle East history at Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. I received my PhD from Harvard University many moons ago. And one of my specialties over the years, as you mentioned, has been Syria, which I first visited in 1989. And I've been to the country over 30 times, including during the Civil War a couple of times. And one of the things I'm known for in this field is that I got to know former President Bashar al-Assad very well, as I wrote a biography of him that was published in 2005. And then at his request, I continued to meet with him on a regular basis as something of a unofficial liaison between Washington and Damascus, especially when U.S.-Syrian relations were not very good during that particular time. And then during the Civil War, I led a group in a conflict resolution initiative that was sponsored by several Scandinavian countries and associated with the United Nations that spoke with many Syrian opposition groups and leaders, civil society groups, as well as members of the Syrian government at that time, and leading officials from most of the countries and players that were involved in the Syrian civil war. As you know, it became, unfortunately, very much a proxy civil war, involved many regional and international powers. And I continued to do that through much of the civil war, those efforts. And here I am today.
Amazing. David, I also wanted to bring to viewers' attention that you obviously speak English, Spanish, French, and you're also a speaker of Arabic. Is that right?
شوية. لا أتكلم لغة عربية جيد جدا. English, let's keep it with English. I'll be embarrassed if we do anything else.
No, that's fine.
One of the problems, every time I go to the Arab world, everyone I meet speaks English much better than I speak Arabic. So we speak English. Heck it.
You have an advantage today. Your Arabic is better than mine. My mother language is Urdu. David, I also wanted to ask you one question before we get into the conversation.
Sure.
I was listening to some of your previous interviews, very fascinating. But all interviews I found were like 12 years old, 15 years old. Is there a reason that you've been silent in the past few years, or is it just that I didn't do a search properly?
Well, I'm not going to accuse you of not doing a search properly. I'm sure you're very good at it. But no, I've been giving talks, especially after the Bashar al-Assad fell. I gave a number of talks on news channels, a number of podcasts. I've given webinars, which I continue to do. Into the certainly late 2000 teens. I think once COVID hit, I really hadn't done much. I was working on some other books that were not focused on Syria, and so I think that's maybe what you're reading is that before Assad fell, probably in the last 4 or 5 years, I hadn't done too much in public, but I have done a lot in private. I continue to be engaged in a number of issues regarding Syria.
Thank you. So David, so as you mentioned, the first time you visited Syria was in 1989. What capacity was that in? Were you like just studying the language or the area, or was you there in an official kind of a capacity?
No, I was a graduate student, and I was conducting research for my dissertation, which later became my first book in 1992. It was the title of the book was Syria and the United States: Eisenhower's Cold War in the Middle East, and I had lined up a number of interviews with some elderly Syrians who were alive during that period and who served in the government in the 1950s. Unfortunately, the Lockerbie bombing had occurred the prior December in 1988. And at first, Syria was looked at as being held responsible. And later on, of course, it was a couple of Libyans that carried it out, of course. But yeah, I came in a very tense environment. And so I really, ironically, didn't get to do the type of research I wanted. But I was there for almost 3 months, and I went all over the country. And since I was a poor graduate student, I had to stay in very low rent hotels and take the microbuses and really interact with the people. And so in a way, I did do research, and I became much more familiar with the country at all levels and fell in love with it and fell in love with the history, the people, etc.
I think you're so right. I had the good fortune to visit Syria around about when the Iraq war was going on, and there was absolutely no tourist in all of Syria. And I think maybe it was that I was appreciated so much, but it was amazing how friendly the people were. A lot of places I didn't really have to, they insisted I stay in their house with them. And it's just amazing how friendly, and even in all these difficult times, how kind of content people seem to be.
I agree. And then you mentioned not many tourists. That's one of the advantages of going to Syria, is that it, of course, it has been under sanctions and has been on opposite sides of the West on a variety of issues. And so you don't see many tourists there. And as you probably experienced, I mean, you go to some of the most incredible historical sites in the world, and you may be the only one there, or you may just be a few of you there. And so you can really take it in. It's great.
Let me tell you a story. So when I went to Syria, everyone was telling me, obviously I'm born here in England. I went from England, and everyone was telling me, don't go there. It's too dangerous. The war's going on next door. But I just wanted to go anyway, just because it's so historic. And for me, it was a toss up between Yemen and Syria. And I was saying at the time, I wanted to go to Afghanistan, Iraq, but everywhere I want to go to, America gets there before I can. So I thought, okay, now I'm going to either go to Syria or to Yemen. So at the end, I chose Syria. And when I went there, everywhere I went, people asked me, where are you from? And I'd say, I'm from Pakistan, because it's a Muslim country. I thought it'd be a safe option. So I'd say, I'm from Pakistan. And they would they'd really greet me. They'd say, you're a brother, welcome, and blah, blah, blah. And then I went to this one hotel where I was trying to book a room. And the guy behind the reception had a chain across on his neck. So clearly a Christian. So he said to me, where are you from? And I thought, maybe I need to have a different approach this time. So I said, I'm from UK. He looked at me and he said, you bastard. And I said, no. Actually, I'm from Pakistan. And he said, okay, you're our brother. But those people, they give us a bad name. What they're doing is horrible. So I thought that was an interesting kind of anecdote.
Yeah. I never really had that experience. And of course, I have to say I'm American. I can maybe get away with Canadian because I look American and act American, and maybe you can get away with GE. I can't get away with it, but it's funny. I had for the most part a great reaction. It was especially early on when not many Westerners were going there. They were saying, "Oh my gosh, it's so great! You're coming to find out for yourself. It's so wonderful that you're here. You're trying to speak the language, and that you're taking a very objective viewpoint toward our country." And a number of Syrians, including high-level Syrian officials, would often tell me, they'd say, Syria would be a much better friend of the United States than Israel. We would be a much better friend than Israel. Israel does its own thing at times, and so there was definitely an element in Syria, certainly until the last 10 years. But when I was there, English was the second language. It had supplanted French. There were English language programs in all the universities and even in the equivalent of their high schools. So they were really looking to try, as Bashar al-Assad was early in his tenure in power, to integrate into the international community, particularly into the West.
Yeah. So David, tell us then, when did you start writing the book on Assad, Bashar al-Assad? But how did that come about? Did you approach Bashar al-Assad? Did he approach you? What was that like?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. In 1995, I took a group of students to spend the summer in Syria, mostly in Aleppo. And I got to know some very good friends, or became very good friends with some people, particularly one person who was a professor at University of Aleppo, who was brought into the government of Bashar al-Assad when Assad came to power after his father's death in 2000. In fact, that's one of the reasons many people in the beginning had hope for Bashar al-Assad, because he brought, non-traditional people, not even members of the Ba'ath Party, into the government. This particular person became a cabinet minister. And in around 2000, early 2004, or actually, I'm sorry, 2002, I wrote him and I said, I know, President Assad has only been in power a couple of years, but he has such a unique background, that he was an ophthalmologist and he, after his brother died in 1994 in a car accident, he was then groomed basically to be president. And, my friend in Syria thought that was interesting. And I didn't hear anything for 2 years. And then about 2 years later, almost to the day, in early 2004, the Syrian ambassador to Washington, who was also a friend of mine, called me up basically and said, David, it's on. And I was like, I didn't even remember. I said, what's on? I had totally forgotten about it. And they said, President Assad would like to meet with you. And so in May 2004, I went to Syria, Damascus, and met extensively with President Assad, met with his wife, met with a number of Syrian officials, met with friends of his, colleagues, teachers of his, and got what I thought was as full a picture as they were allowing me to get at the time. And during that, of course, I wrote the book, which came out, published by Yale University Press in the fall of 2005. And so, and I continued to meet with him, in 2005 a couple of times before, writing the end of the book, which came out then. So, I was given a great deal of access, not access to everybody, but a great deal of access to his circle.
And how was that? How did the very first meeting go? Were you nervous? And also, was it like a presidential palace? What kind of a surrounding was it?
No, we first met in what's called the Rauda building. It's the name of the area in Damascus, just north of Umayyad Square. And it's a very pedestrian-looking building. It's like a middle-class building. And, they have the People's Palace up on the hill, but he spent very little time there, certainly during my visits to him in Syria. I only met him once in the People's Palace one time, and that was only because he had met with the president of another country and was already there. But I usually met with him in this building, and he was very prompt, which was totally unlike his father, who kept people waiting for hours, cooling their heels. And that was one of the things that Bashar wanted to do that was different from his father. And it was all coordinated, and I, met him, and yeah, of course I was a bit nervous, but we got along pretty well at first. I explained what I was going to do, and then I said, Mr. President, one of the worst things you ever did when you became president in 2000 is that you let it be known that you like Western music, like Phil Collins, like the Electric Light Orchestra, the Beatles. And he kind of looked at me, and I said, you didn't quite understand what I was getting at, but I said, because there has been this image of you created in the West that you're this modernizing pro-Western reformer. And in some ways you are, but the expectations far exceed what you can do within the system. And so he realized that, and that's very true. The expectations in the West were way too high.
Yeah. What about the book? When it got published, I'm guessing he read it. What did you think about it?
Well, it's interesting. I asked him after the book was published, and I said, "Did you read it?" And he said, "No, I haven't, because I lived it." And I don't know whether I believe him or not, but he said he had not. But he said he had asked his advisors who had read it, and they said, "You give me a fair treatment. You're critical at times and so forth, but that you're fair, in your assessment."
Were there at any point, were there any bits that he asked you not to put in, or any kind of, how free were you to write?
No, there wasn't. Interesting. I mean, it was, I recorded our conversations and then I transcribed them at night in the hotel. And then I deleted most of the conversations. But he never said, "Don't put this in." The only thing, one of his advisors asked me, if there's a second edition, could you, the name is a little bit off here, or I got the wrong department of something. But it was, no, I never was asked not to include something from our
It's
conversation.
very unusual, no, for an art reader. That's a part.
Yeah, it is. And I thought we got, we were pretty open, and he was pretty open with me on a number of things. And, in fact, I met some of his childhood teachers, and, they were openly told me he was not very good in math. He got a D in math, or that he acted up at one school and his parents, moved him to another school for disciplinary reasons, And
Well,
so I thought that was,
they were able to say that. Yeah.
I was able to I was able to write that. And, certainly, I appreciated that. And that's one of the things I found out, that his family growing up, and something he tried to do with his own family after he married and had kids, and this was confirmed with his wife, Asma al-Assad, is they tried to live as normal life as possible, which meant, his mother went to, the equivalent of PTA meetings with teachers to talk about, his progress. And it wasn't just mailed in, the teachers weren't intimidated to give him A's all the way through or anything like that. So, and he tried to do that with his own family. Certainly during the time I knew him. I think obviously circumstances changed during the Civil War.
That's very different to like Gaddafi family or Saddam Hussein family.
Saddam Hussein. Oh, absolutely. In fact, in the biography I write on him, I make those comparisons. I compare to the sons of Uday and Qusay of Saddam Hussein, who intimidated their teachers and threatened to kill them if they didn't give them good grades.
Yeah.
Very, very different.
David, tell me, last week I interviewed Professor Stephen Zunes, and a question I asked him as well is that, so a lot of these Arab leaders, they seem to be like really entrenched with like complete control over society and everything. But a lot of these leaders have been unsuccessful in passing that power onto the next generation, whether that was Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein or Hosni Mubarak. Why is that? Is that because they got overthrown before they could get to that stage? Or is there something, why was Hafiz al-Assad able to do what all of these other people tried and couldn't quite get to?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, they're supposed to be, especially in the ones with monarchies, of course, it's natural. They pass it on to a son or family member. But these are supposed to be republics.
Yeah.
And I have constitutions and parliaments. And, when Hafiz al-Assad died, according to the constitution, the vice president should take over. As in any country, the vice president, it was Abdul Halim Khadem at the time, should take over, but he didn't. And essentially what happened, according to my sources, is, leading members of the military and the security apparatus got together and basically said, who's the best person to keep this going, to keep this system as we know it going? And they decided that Bashar al-Assad, the eldest living son at the time, was the right person. So it wasn't ensured
He was even under the constitutional age to be president, no?
He was under, and then they changed it. They raised it to 34, right? I think, which was his age at the time. They raised it in a both-party parliamentary session. And so it was all arranged. It was not, there was no election or anything. And you see this, I think in these other countries, you saw attempts along these lines. But even in countries where there were no really free elections or any elections at all, unless you get the elite core, surrounding you, including military security apparatus, leading political figures in the government, in some cases leading imams or something like that, you have to get them on board and they have to buy in, and that takes work. It's not just default by that a son in a Libya or Egypt or Syria even, or in Iraq. I'm sure Saddam Hussein had lived. Probably one of his sons might have taken over, but that's not assured. And so I think some of the things that many people in the West don't realize, it's much more nuanced in these countries, even an authoritarian, dictatorship, so to speak. And there are pockets of power you have to satisfy that the father created, and the father manipulated and negotiated and learned the experience of, and had the experience of manipulating and negotiating and threatening at times these particular groups. But when that father dies, the younger one does not have that credibility, legitimacy, and neither did Bashar. I mean, I think for 4 or 5 years, he really had to fight in order to get things done. It was really only, in my mind, by 2006 did he have his people in power and got rid of some of the so-called old guard that he inherited from his father. So it's not an easy thing, and it's not assured that a son will come to power. But in some cases, such as in Libya, the father is removed and the whole government is removed, so the son doesn't have a chance, even though one of his sons, Saif Gaddafi, was contacted by some groups that, once the civil war started, maybe you can come back and, be different than your father. So, it's interesting, that whole process.
Yes. Also, obviously, we know that later things went very badly, and we'll talk about the reasons for that and the situation as it exists now. But before we get there, I remember when I went there, obviously there's the fear of intelligentsia, the mukhabarat. Everyone was, if I ask any questions to anyone, they would always look over their shoulder who's listening. They would question, or for a minute, they would pause and think, are they safe talking to me about these things? So there was that fear of intelligentsia, but obviously there was still peace and stability, and the society was functioning very well, I thought. And at that time, I was thinking that maybe it's a strength that Bashar al-Assad is not. I myself, obviously, I'm a Sunni Muslim, but at the time I was thinking maybe this is a strength that Bashar al-Assad and his family are not from the majority of the country. Because they're a minority, they have to get all of these other groups on board to be able to govern, and maybe that's the strength of the country.
Yeah, no, they did have to work hard, both his father and Bashar. But you add up the Alawites, which is of course the Shiite sect from which Bashar and his family emerged, about 10-13% of the country. Christian Syrians about 10-13%. Druze, 3-4%. Kurds, who've had a on and off again relationship with the Assads over the years. You get up to, as well as the Sunni business class that they courted, Sunni Sufi imams and tariqas, religious orders that they courted. You're getting at about 50% of the country, and so even if the other 50%, largely Sunni Arab, are against you, you can still, that's enough to rule. And there was They co-opted a number of Sunnis into the government. They brought a number of Sunnis, Sunni ministers. Bukar al-Shara, the long-serving foreign minister, was Sunni. The Talas family, longtime defense minister for Bashar al-Assad, and then General Manaf Talas was head of the 4th Armored Division for Bashar al-Assad, or from Homs, and they're Sunni. So they reached out enough to keep it together. And I think that's one of the things what you mentioned earlier, about the stability. The Assads offered this Faustian bargain to the Syrian population, basically implicitly saying you will give up some freedoms. There will be restrictions, but you're going to have stability and at times opportunities for prosperity.
Yeah.
And that largely worked, especially when you had the example of Lebanon to the west and Iraq to the east, similarly sectarian countries that fell apart, for different reasons, obviously, but fell apart. And so, to many Syrians, they were willing to accept that Faustian bargain, as an island of stability in an otherwise very unstable Middle East. And the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, they exploited that, certainly, and combined with the security apparatus, which kept opposition at bay and through arrests and other means, they were able to keep this thing together. I think one of the things I mentioned earlier, I brought a group of students from America to Syria in the summer of 1995, and they were all surprised at how wide that apparent to them at the time, the margins of freedom were.
Yeah.
And if you knew the red lines, you don't criticize the regime or the president, you don't mention Hamas in 1982.
Yeah.
And then there are certain, certain customs to which you'd have to adhere and so forth. But they were surprised overall at how wide. Yeah. And again, I think this gets to your point. Most, people in the West, they think about Syria and they think of it as a, Stalinist state under the Assads. And, to some Syrians, it probably is and was.
Yes.
But, it's different. And I think maybe you experience this as well. Yes, many people are looking over their shoulders and so forth. And I was followed. I'm sure you were followed. I had a camera in my vent in my hotel room. My phones were probably tapped. Especially 1989. What's this American? You're all by himself traveling around the country. So that happens. And if you can, if you're Syrians, you get used to that. I think, what most of them, really, in addition to that, and, to many who it was an affront to their freedoms and dignity, it was just the lack of economic opportunity as time went on, and especially in the rural areas, that provided the foundation for the uprising that began in 2011.
Also, as you touched upon, so Bashar al-Assad, he wasn't like the natural choice for succession after Hafiz al-Assad. That was going to be his brother, who passed away. He got killed in a car crash or something.
Correct.
So the story of Bashar al-Assad is quite fascinating. He was kind of like a reluctant not reluctant, but not unexpected kind of remind me a little bit of The Godfather and Michael Corleone.
Yes. Yeah. Although a lot of critics of Bashar early on called him, because they thought it was weak, they called him Fredo and not Michael. But he turned out to be more like Michael, I think, in the end. Fredo, for better or worse. So, yeah, no, he's very, very, very much the reluctant one. He really loved being an ophthalmologist. And I remember one time he told me that, I really appreciate, as an ophthalmologist, you go in, you do a surgery, and someone who can't see can now see. There is a definite result, a positive result. And he said, as president of Syria, I rarely get to see the positive results.
Wow.
Because you have to work and things just, especially in a inert system like that, a dilapidated system that he inherited, it's very difficult to see progress in any short-term way. And, I think, that very much frustrated him.
So, in Syria, we had the Ba'ath Party. In Iraq, we had the Ba'ath Party. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Were the two things connected, or what was the Ba'ath Party?
Sure. I mean, the Ba'ath Party was a secular Arab nationalist party founded by a couple of Syrians who were actually communists at first, but then became socialists, who studied at the Sorbonne in Paris in the 1930s. And the Ba'ath Party, as Arab nationalism, secular Arab nationalism, especially opposition to Western imperialism and the mandate system that existed at that time, grew. So did the Ba'ath Party. And the Ba'ath Party in Syria, its motto was freedom, unity, and socialism. And it was really very much about anti-Western attitudes, freedom from the West, unity in the Arab world, bring countries together, bring the whole Arab world together in order to have the strength in order to withstand Western encroachment, and socialism in order to escape the economic imperialism of the West that was, in the Ba'athist mind, that was manifested through, the capitalist private sector, particularly the large landowners in a place like Syria and other areas. And so they developed cells, Ba'ath cells, in a number of different countries. And one of the places that it really took hold as well was in Iraq, and in a different way. And the Ba'ath Party in Iraq came to power in February 1963, and a month later in Syria. And of course, the Ba'ath Party stayed in power in Iraq all the way till the fall of Saddam Hussein in 2003, and in Syria until Bashar al-Assad fell. But they had long become vestigial remnants of their former self. They were just shells through which power was articulated. They had lost much of their esprit de corps, much of their original ethos and founding. I mean, the Ba'ath Party traditionally appealed to the rural masses, and by the time Bashar al-Assad, certainly, over the course of his time in power, became more of an urban party that alienated the rural masses. So, it very much switched gears in that regard. But the Ba'ath Party also, there were some intra-Ba'ath disputes, differences, ideological differences in the early to mid 1960s, when actually one of the original founders of the Ba'ath Party, Michel Aflaq, actually went to Iraq and gave the Ba'ath Party their much added legitimacy, and it continued to grow there. But the Ba'ath Party that basically I would say got rid of, but certainly pushed Michel Aflaq and others, the original founders, aside. They thought they were too accommodationist. They thought they were too accommodationist to outside powers and not ideological enough in trying to attain the goals of Arab unity and Arab nationalism. And so that branch continued on in Syria, and then a different branch that then was appropriated by Saddam Hussein and his people and became very much of a different party. It became, again, a single party dictatorship in Iraq, and a single party dictatorship when Hafiz al-Assad came to power soon after in 1970.
I think the Middle East is such a eventful place. There's constantly so much going on, and everything is interconnected, that sometimes I think we forget that, and we try to look at things in isolation. But if we look at things in that kind of context of what was going on at any given time in the surrounding areas, a bit like how you mentioned when you came over, there was a Lockerbie bombing, and how that impacted things. Similarly, in what happened in Syria when Hafiz al-Assad came, and there was a war with Israel, and they lost the Golan Heights. So all of those things, sometimes we forget, like all of these people, these who come into power, they're like a child of their time. And back in those days, socialism was such a big force in the Middle East.
Yeah. And it's, you said a child, a child of the times. And in a way, I mean, the Arab countries, most of them, certainly a place like Syria, Egypt, Iraq, countries that were under the mandate system, although Egypt officially wasn't, but it was under British control in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, the whole mandate system was supposed to prepare these populations for independence and self-supervision and a stable political system, but they failed disastrously. They did not prepare. Particularly, the French were worse than the British. And the French in Lebanon and in Syria did not prepare the elite classes for a life of politics. It was very immature political systems that, even if left to their own devices, it would have been very, very difficult to develop a sustainable democracy. But you throw in to immature, unstable political systems, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the inter-Arab Cold War, the superpower Cold War, and the fact that, at the time, 2/3 of the world's known oil reserves were in that area, it's going to get a lot of attention and a lot of interference. And so, I like to say that many of these Middle East countries, or Arab countries in particular, did not have the time to develop the time and the space to develop stable political systems on their own. I mean, look at the United States. We were isolated from everybody in the world, and we still had a civil war, Reconstruction, civil rights problem. We still have, issues. And again, we were able to do this relatively free from outside intervention, whereas the Middle East just hasn't had that benefit. And so, while going through the growing pains of political evolution, we have to remember that most of these countries, are only had 80 years or less of independence. And that's a very, very short period of time. And the U.S. only gave women the right to vote 100 years ago. So, these are very young political entities that were not prepared for independence and self-rule, and then had to deal with all of these external factors and interference. And so it's not a surprise to me that the only thing that tends to produce some level of stability is a military dictatorship or an outside power coming in and establishing its authority.
Yeah. Especially the way these countries have been carved up to begin with is not a natural kind of a boundary. So they have so many built-in internal problems from day one.
Exactly. And particularly the nature of identity. What are they? A friend of mine, before the Syrian civil war, went in and held an informal survey and asked Syrian Arabs, do you consider yourself Syrian Arab Muslims? If you consider yourself a Syrian first, an Arab first, or a Muslim first? And it was about a third for each. A third, at number one was a Muslim, a third, number one was Arab, and a third Syrian. And this goes back to, this lack of identity in these countries. That goes back to what you were saying, when many of these countries were carved up artificially and, developed, and many of them sectarian in terms of ethnicity or religion. And many of these people, especially with a weak, central government or a government they think is illegitimate, they retreat into their sectarian fortresses, and that becomes their primary identity. They become very proprietary about it. And since many of these regimes lack legitimacy in the eyes of many of these people, they're not willing to integrate into this national identity. As hard as the Ba'ath Party tried to create an Arab identity, a secular Arab identity, it ultimately was not successful.
Yeah. So David, so throughout, when you were writing Assad's biography, and afterwards you've been in touch with him, what kind of relationships how do you describe the relationship you had with him? Was it like the professional, was it a personal relationship? Was it a friendship?
Yeah, I think that's a good question, and I've been asked. We certainly got along, and we were, more we saw of each other, the more open we were in terms of our interviews. I tried to never lose sight that it was a professional relationship, and that, he was, there was a reason why he wanted to meet with me. And there's a reason why he wanted to continue to meet with me. And on the other hand, people keep saying, and not just me, but a lot of people who met with him, and these are diplomats, long-serving diplomats who met with guys like Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi, and met with Bashar al-Assad. They all said Bashar al-Assad was a different cat. He was a different guy. He was normal. And
even when you hear him talk, the way he was so kind of soft-spoken and
yes, yeah, very very much awkward, even mild-mannered. Certainly when I met him, self-deprecating. He would often say, "I made these mistakes," and so a lot of people, when the atrocities occurred during the Syrian civil war and what we found out about the prisons following his overthrow, it doesn't jibe with that person. And again, the last time I saw him was in 2009, and war can change people. Maybe the civil war changed him. I think he very much, as I used to say, many people hoped he would change the system, but he assimilated into the system. And he became part and parcel of it rather than changing. I think early on he tried to change it, but got so much resistance that it was basically impossible. And, I remember one time, usually I had very privileged access when I'd enter the country. One time in 2007 in November, I was stopped at Syrian airport and customs and then interrogated for over 3 hours. And I kept saying, "I'm meeting with your president tomorrow. Why are you doing this?" And they kept saying I was, making it up and all this sort of stuff. And finally, I convinced the colonel who was interrogating me to call the office of the president. And he called him, and he found out. Oh my God! I mean, you could see the look in his face that, oh my gosh, you are who you say you are. You're meeting with the president. And the next morning, I met with Assad, and as he usually does, he said, "Well, Dr. Lesch, how was your trip?" And I said, "Well, other than the 3-hour interrogation at the airport, it was fine." And he was just appalled. He goes, "Why did this happen?" And I remember telling him, I said, by that time, I could be somewhat frank with him. I said, "Mr. President, unless you get control of these guys, the mukhabarat, the security guy, unless you get control of these guys, they're going to come back to haunt you." And he looked, and he said, I know they have excesses, but I need them. This is a dangerous age.
What happened, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So that's exactly what happened. They're the ones, that roughed up and tortured those kids, teenagers in Daraa in March, April 2011 that lit the uprising there in Daraa that spread to other countries. And so it was kind of prophetic in that way that, he never got control of them.
So the last time you met him was 2009. Did you have any email or any other communication with him or after that?
Indirectly, I worked on, those conflict resolution initiatives. In fact, I was in Damascus during one of the high points of the civil war in February 2013 and met with some of his leading officials in the same building, in that Rauda building. And Bashar was one floor up, and I asked one of the people, the official, I said, would you mind if I go up and said hello? And they immediately said, no, he's busy right now. There was no way I was going to see them. And the reason for that is that I wrote another book that was published in 2012, that in a second edition came out in 2013, again, Yale University Press, that was called The Fall of the House of Assad.
Oh, no.
And I didn't necessarily choose the title. Publishers have a way of choosing titles to gain readership. But I was told the president did not like that. He didn't like the title. And I was actually kind of persona non grata. I'm surprised I was let in at this time, but that was for perhaps some other reasons. They thought I was an emissary bringing conflict resolution alternatives and all that sort of stuff. But no, I was persona non grata with him for some time. In fact, I was going to have a dinner with a close relative of his in London some years later, 2017 or 18 or something like that. And it was arranged when we were about to meet. An intermediary who knew this relative had set it up. And when I arrived at dinner, the intermediary told me that the person, the relative with whom I was meeting, got a call from the boss, as they said, from Bashar, a personal call saying, don't meet with David Lesch.
Oh, wow.
So that tells me he took it a little personal. And that my criticisms, I mean, I wrote a New York Times op-ed early in the uprising in April 2011, criticizing Bashar's first speech to the nation, reacting to the uprising. And I called it pathetic, and it was pathetic. In fact, one Syrian official secretly told me it was pathetic, but they didn't like that. And I remember one of someone I looked up to as far as being a Syrian specialist, Patrick Seal, from Britain. He was a acclaimed journalist, wrote some wonderful books, was the biographer of Hafiz al-Assad. And since I was a biographer of Bashar, we had known each other for a while, became really together at that time. But he told me one time, he said, David, the Syrian government, the leaders, you can say 99 good things about Syria and one bad thing, and they'll focus on the bad. And that's what they'll remember. And they'll punish you for it, So, and I guess that's kind of the same sort of attitude they take with the population, unfortunately.
Very true. So when the uprising did begin in 2011, firstly, were you surprised? But secondly, do you actually think it was the peaceful demonstrations and everything was organic, as I understand it? But when it turned violent, do you think that was actually instigated by the government side? Because I've seen a lot of sources, even in the BBC, that mentions that a lot of violence, armed guns and weapons were present amongst the population that was uprising. And a lot of the weapons and the firing and everything started from not the center of Syria, but from the surrounding areas, which were if they're near to the border, it means it's easier to have outside influence in them. How do you see, do you think was the nature of that uprising?
Well, it's a mix of a lot of things, a confluence of many things. There's this political science term called demonstration effects. And we saw this with the so-called Arab Spring in late 2010, 2011, when protests and demonstrations in one country, when they're successful, as they were in Tunisia to begin with, they have demonstration effects elsewhere in the region, as they did in Libya, as they did in Egypt. And when these governments and especially Hosni Mubarak fell, also in February, I believe, 2011, in the most populous Arab country, many people throughout the region, Arabs throughout the region, thought they could do that in their countries. And both opposition as well as Syrian government people told me the same thing, that the barrier of fear was broken in Syria, that people had been afraid to go against the government because of its repressive activities, because they had put down, the memory of 1982 in Hamad, when anywhere between 20 and 40,000 people were killed, when there was an uprising there. Their ability to maintain order, it scared off a lot of would-be attempts and protests against the government because they were so quickly quelled. But because of these were successful elsewhere, people in Syria, the opposition, felt it would be successful here, and obviously they were wrong at first. Eventually, they were correct. They also thought they were going to get much more support from the West and the United States, and that did not happen. That did not materialize, and that was probably something a number of opposition guys I spoke to, they told me that if we knew that this uprising would turn into this full-fledged civil war without really any hope, at least at that time, 2013, 14, 15, of success, we never would have started it. But that's hindsight. And at the time, difference between living forward and looking backward. Living forward, they thought they would have success, and they got just enough support from other countries in the area to keep going. And basically each side didn't have the wherewithal to win decisively, at least without outside support. And that's why it continued to go on. But I remember saying early on, even in that book, The Fall of the House of Assad, I said toward the end, the most likely outcome is that he would stay in power for a while, because this is such a hard nut to crack. One, the opposition is fragmented, supported by outside powers with different agendas. And two, contrary to what happened in Libya or Tunisia or Egypt or even Yemen, the core of the Syrian regime stayed together. There were very few high-profile defections, and especially the Alawites and others who were associated with the regime, and Christians too, especially as the opposition took on a much more jihadist character and shape. Many minorities, religious minorities in Syria, were worried about it, and therefore, reluctantly perhaps supported the regime. But the core of the regime were very much sink or swim together. I remember one opposition militia leader, one of the ones I interviewed in southern Turkey, in Gaziantep, and in northern Syria in 2012 and 13. He told me, he said, I hate his militia. We hate encountering Alawite brigades. And I said, why? Because they know we're going to kill them all, so they'll fight to the death. Whereas, if it was a largely Sunni brigade, they may give up or surrender because they figure that fellow Sunni Muslims would not execute them. And so, there was this, even though a number of Alawites over the years became disenchanted with Bashar al-Assad, they knew that they would sink or swim with him. And so, they fought tenaciously to try to stay in power.
And that's what we're seeing now, isn't it? With like a lot of these Alawites kind of bunkered up in Latakia, Tartus. We saw like some fighting in recent weeks.
Yeah, exactly. There were some atrocities carried out. I mean, according to the reports, some Alawites carried out a surprise attack against current Syrian government forces, and then and that just opened up a Pandora's box of not only the Syrian government responding with its forces, but untrained, uncontrollable militias from all over the country who have been fighting against the Alawites for long during the Civil War, all of a sudden just flocked to Latakia and Tartus in that area, and they were not under the command and control of the current government. And that's how we had, so many hundreds, if not thousands of Alawites being killed. I'm actually kind of surprised this didn't happen earlier, because many of the most conservative Salafist and jihadist Sunni Syrian militia groups, and a number of Sunni Muslims from outside of Syria, Chechens, Uyghurs, Central Asian ones, had come into Syria to help the opposition. And some of those guys are pretty fanatical. And for a decade, they'd all been indoctrinated that Alawites, if not beforehand, that Alawites are heathen scum, heathen filth. And plus, the Alawites during the Civil War, Syrian government militias and government forces had carried out certain indignities against opposition guys. And so this is a very nasty civil war. And so, I'm not surprised that this happened. I'm kind of surprised it didn't happen earlier. Hopefully it's contained. But I know the Alawites in the country, particularly in the Northwest, are very fearful. They even asked for Israeli protection. The irony of irony is they even asked for Israeli protection. And I think, frankly thinking, I believe that if they can, over the course of time, would like to carve out kind of an Alawite, if not autonomous zone, maybe even their own country in that area. So that's something to keep an eye on as we move forward.
Yes, I think you're right. But it's so messy because of the geopolitics with Turkey, Israel, all of these other countries, and what's happening or what might happen with the Kurds. But all of that is going to have some kind of an impact on what.
Yeah, I mean, the challenge to this current government, one is trying to integrate all of these militias that are independent or semi-independent of the government, I mean, this is a highly militarized society, guns everywhere, militias all over the place. Trying to integrate them into a national army is imperative, and it will take time, and it's not at all assured, especially when the economy is so dilapidated. I mean, this is, 90% of the population is below the poverty line. There's, over a decade of economic despair. The economy's in a shambles amid over a decade of punishing international sanctions, that most of which are still in place. And so how's the central government even going to pay a national army? How are they going to provide economic growth under these conditions? I mean, they're in a kind of a honeymoon period where people are enjoying the freedoms and extra freedoms after the fall of Assad. But pretty soon they're going to want, some to see some economic growth and be able to live a sustainable life. And so these are incredible challenges for the current government, and so it remains to be seen.
Yeah. Reminds me of the situation in Afghanistan with so many ethnic groups mistrusting each other, so much weapons, and then so much outside influence that it just makes it very difficult to bring unity.
Yeah, exactly. Or in Iraq or in Lebanon, I think the people are so war weary and so just tired of deprivation for well over a decade that, they're willing to give this government a chance. They're the only game in town right now, and Ahmed Shara, the president, is saying the right things and doing many of the right things. But there's so many structural problems to the country that creates, a foundation for instability. It's going to be very, very difficult. And I think, one of the keys is getting the U.S. to lift the international sanctions. I think a lot of countries want to interact economically with this new government, but they don't want to run afoul of the Treasury Department. They'll err on the side of caution and not engage because they don't want to be sanctioned by the United States. So until the U.S. lifts or waives its sanctions, it's going to be very, very tough.
David, two questions. Firstly, did you see the Assad regime collapsing so swiftly when the end did come? And secondly, during the civil war, as you said, that you were working in trying to bring resolution, trying to bring build bridges or dialogue between the different sides. At any stage, did you get to speak with Ahmed al-Shara or any of these people? Or did you even know about them at that time?
Yeah, I'll answer the last question first. No, I didn't. One, it was, Jabhat al-Nusra, certainly ISIS when it came in, were labeled international terrorism group. So it was illegal for me, especially as an organization that was associated with the UN, receiving funds from Western countries, to talk with any of those people. However, having said that, I think we talked to people who later joined, Jabhat al-Nusra, or what later became Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which is, Ahmed Shara's group. So we got some of their views of the situation. And so no one officially did I talk to that's in the, well, actually, I take that back. I know some people in the current government that was just put together, but none of the top leadership right now. Now, as far as the first question, did I see the fall of Bashar al-Assad happening and the regime happening so rapidly? No. And I don't think anyone did. I mean, looking back, obviously, and even before he fell, I could see that there were clear signs that things weren't going well in Syria. There had been demonstrations. The economy was a mess. It became a narco state. But on the outside, Bashar al-Assad was being rehabilitated regionally. He was allowed back into the Arab League. A number of countries reestablished diplomatic relations, including some from the European Union. Even the U.S. started to engage with him behind the scenes in certain ways. So, on the outside, it seemed that he was being accepted, and maybe the sanctions would be, it was a race against time, really. Would the sanctions be lifted to allow him to stay in power? And obviously no. And I guess what we saw was that the country was much weaker than we thought. The economy was much worse than we thought. The Syrian military, which is a conscript military, I mean, many of the soldiers were living in poverty themselves. They weren't being paid.
Yeah.
Some of the conditions they were living in pictures shown after the fall, they were living in horrible conditions. And so they're not going to fight. They have no will to fight. It was a car without an engine under Assad toward the end. It was a shell of its former self. And just, nobody was going to put their lives on the line to fight to keep this in power in the end. And I think that's why it fell so quickly. And the Russians and the Iranians saw that, why they started, removing personnel fairly soon after the initial offensive by HTS. And so they know more than anyone else because, they've been on the ground with Assad and Syrian society in general. And I think once the Iranians left, Assad knew his days were numbered.
Yeah. David, I'm enjoying this conversation so much. Time's flying by, but I don't want to take your time beyond what we agreed. But there's still so much to talk about what's happening now, the geopolitics, the relations between Syria, Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, all of those things. I'd love to have you back another day.
But sure. I'd be happy to.
Yeah, it'd be amazing to have you back.
Dude, I enjoyed it as well.
Thank you, David. Before you go, two last things. Obviously, I'd love to talk to you about your publications. But before we even talk about that, do you have any plans of ever visiting Russia and maybe getting a chance to see al-Assad? That would be amazing, I think.
Be very interesting.
It's just really unanswered questions on what happened and why did you leave without.
And I'm sure he'd be willing to try to get his story out, his narrative out. I have thought of it because there have actually been some news organizations that have contacted me, said, can you, they would like to interview him. And I know some people that know him and could get in contact with him, but, right now, sorry about that. Right now it's, with Russian-U.S. relations the way they are, it could be a bit difficult.
Yeah, it would be amazing if you do get a chance, and if you need someone to carry your luggage with you, let me know.
Well, I'd be glad to have you with me,
David. So I think you've written published more than 15 books. Published, this is by you.
Yeah, I have 17 books that I published. Some of them edited works, and most of them are about over half single-authored works. But my latest one is from Oxford University Press called The Middle East Since the Rise of Islam. And it's an overall history of the region since the time of the Prophet Muhammad. And it's something I've wanted to write for a long time. And I kind of wrote it. It was kind of my COVID book. Because obviously, like all of us, we were stuck at home. And since it was a book I long wanted to write, I contacted Oxford and I said, would you be interested? And they said, sure, because I'd published some other things with them. And I was able to write it during a 2-year period, and it was published in 2023.
Also, David, in one of your interviews, I've heard you also recommend, if someone was wanting to know more about Islam, you recommended John Esposito. I was really happy to hear that because I had the pleasure of interviewing John Esposito. I've read his books for so long while I was in university. Lovely guy, and he'll be happy. I'll email him to let him know about this interview as well.
Yeah, no, he's very good, and he's written some wonderful works geared for the general audience as well. So I do recommend it.
Amazing academic, but also a lovely human being.
Yes, absolutely.
David, one last question. I belong to I'm a Sunni Muslim, and I kind of have sympathies for Sufism and stuff. And I know Sufism was quite a heavy influence in Syria. How strong are the Sufi populations there, or how are they? Because now we have a Salafi government there. So are they under threat? What's happening with the people from Sufi background in Syria?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't have a specific answer, but I am a little concerned because Bashar al-Assad courted the Sufi orders very, very closely and successfully during his time in power. And so in addition to being Sufis, which, as you know, Salafists don't particularly like, they are associated with the former regime.
Yes.
So, one thing is the world is watching, especially with what happened to the Alawites recently, especially if they want the sanctions lifted. So, hopefully that's enough international leverage to, prevent them from doing anything untoward. I think we're seeing the current government in Syria. It's going to be a sectarian majoritarian government. It's going to be a Sunni Arab, conservative Sunni Arab government that tolerates minorities, but those minorities may clearly be second-class citizens. And so, I know that everyone wants Syria to be this inclusive, non-sectarian government, but it's not like these guys are former al-Qaeda, Jabhat al-Nusra. It's not like they fell in love with the Geneva Convention and human rights all of a sudden. So there's a lot of guys in there, even despite what Ahmed Shara, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he has changed, and you can change. And people that I know that know him say he's more of a pragmatist, but there's a lot of people in his movement that aren't. So he has to get control of them. And I'm not sure he can do that. But I hope he does.
David, thank you so much. Thank you for your time and your generosity and your insights and everything. I really enjoyed it. Let's get better again soon.
Okay, sure thing.
Are you a video content creator struggling to keep up with your channel? How many times have you promised yourself and your audience that you'll stay consistent with your video uploads? We get it. A half-hour video can take 4 to 5 hours to edit, especially if you're still learning the ropes. Then there's scripting, uploading, promoting through YouTube or Google Ads, not to mention booking quality guest speakers if you run a podcast type channel. It can all get very stressful very fast. At Kianistan Studios, we see it all the time. Many talented content creators quit just before their channel is due to take off, simply because they cannot keep up with the workload. My name is Taryn, and I represent Kianistan Studios, where we provide complete A to Z services to content creators just like yourself. Your content deserves to stand out. At Kianistan Studios, we transform raw footage into engaging, high-quality videos and ensure your audio is crystal clear. No more technical headaches, just seamless storytelling. Whether it's shorts, reels, YouTube videos, or podcasts, we handle the entire process from start to finish. Do you record with a green screen? We can replace your background and put you in an office, a library, or even a breathtaking landscape. Absolutely anywhere you like. And then there are thumbnails. We all know how important a killer thumbnail is. After all, your title and thumbnail are the only things convincing people to click on your video. At Kianistan Studios, our experienced graphic designers bring your vision to life, helping you grab attention and get more views. Everyone has their own style when it comes to audio and visual effects, and that's great. If you want to add extra flair while keeping your videos unique and authentic, we have you covered. Wow! Did you see that? Do you need guest speakers for your podcast or interviews? We can help you find top quality guests for your show. Need a producer to be present during your recording? No problem. Our team has experience working with all major platforms like Riverside and can ensure everything runs smoothly. Okay, so you've put in the work to create an awesome video. Now it's time to get it in front of the right audience. Whether you're on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, or Facebook, we create targeted ad campaigns to help your content reach more people and grow your channel. Thanks for watching. Whether you're just starting out or an established creator looking to level up while cutting down your workload and stress, we've got a tailored package for you. And as a special thank you, I'm offering a free video edit up to 30 minutes, no cost, no risk. Try us out and see the results for yourself. Get in touch today. I promise you'll be impressed not just by our work, but by our professionalism and communication every step of the way. Click on the link and ask for Taryn, and I look forward to speaking with you soon.